recording. And so, do you want to catch us up at this point?
Sure, yeah. So where we left off last was about the guardians, discussing guardians. And the reason one needs guardians is to protect their city from within and without. That means if there's an external force trying to come and take over the city, the guardians can protect. And then if there is internal strife, the guardians can protect against. And for that, guardians have to be well trained. First, you got to find the right guardians, the right people who could be guardians, and then you have to train them appropriately. And so what was the training? The training was to build their soul and to build them physically. The way to build the soul was through music and stories. Stories were of two kinds, fiction and non-fiction. And Socrates discusses the Homeric poems and what the poems described about the dichotomy of what it meant to be a god, where a god could do good things and mean things, and how that could then influence somebody to believe that in their own lives they can perform both of these things and still be considered to be akin to a god. And so we need to guard against that. Guardians should not be exposed to this kind of a dichotomy before they are in a position to make judgments about themselves. So that's where we were at. And we use that to kind of talk about our own experiences in life coming up to now, because the book so far is not about how to build a just city. It's about how to build a just human being, that human being being ourselves.
And that is the key analogy here. And so this is my second read through Republic, but this is my first in-depth read through Republic. And reading the Republic through the lens of, they're not just building a republic here. What they're trying to do is build an individual. Again, because Socrates, the challenge that was laid before him was, show us where justice is. And so the idea was, well, if we can magnify the individual to a city or a state, then maybe we can find it. And so it's clear to me, or the way I interpret this is, as you read this, you're looking for analogies between the structures and institutions that they're building in this slowly evolving just state, and look for the internal individual analogy for what they're describing. And so where we pick up in book 3, they have gotten to the point now where they're talking about the guardians of the city, guardians of the city-state. And this is the point in the book, which if you're reading and following along, things take an authoritarian turn, okay? Because this is where Socrates starts to talk about the education and the indoctrination of the guardians. And I think one thing I would hasten to add at this point is, if you're reading and following along, that what we have to keep in mind is two things. First, we have to account for our own bias. So Socrates, Adeimantus, and Glaucon, they are in a city-state that is a pure democracy, meaning everybody gets a vote. And they're also they're also living in the shadow of Homer, who holds this very lofty position as the poet of poets, and he is often cited in their day-to-day dealings. And so often when they're talking about the information that they want to shield their guardians from, they are usually, unflattering portrayals of the gods that Homer has provided through the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the items of information they do want the guardians to learn from are the more positive and moral aspects in terms of the behaviors of the gods and the characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So you would actually also do well. I don't think you need to read the Iliad or the Odyssey to understand these references, but it would certainly help. But what we're at now is, this is the beginning of the authoritarian streak in this book. And so the second thing that I was going to say is, so first we have to understand the contextual history of this. So from their standpoint, they're trying to effect a new iteration of a republic that's different than theirs. And so here they're breaking things down to brass tacks. They don't want any contamination that could lead to institutional injustice. And so that's why they're resorting to what you could call authoritarian things. But the second part to it, and this is maybe where I may disagree with other folks who read this, I actually think Socrates has a pretty good rationale behind what you would consider these authoritarian things because of what I said at the beginning. This is the analogy of the individual. And at a certain point, at the individual level, you are the ultimate authority of your own thoughts and actions. And so therefore, you should exercise that authority when you're making decisions. So to kind of catch us up, and to summarize this section, they begin talking about what sorts of stories they're going to expose the guardians to during their education. And so they start off by talking about stories of the gods, which is where we left off at the last episode. So some stories will be told, especially the ones that are moral and positive and virtuous, but some will be untold. And so the Iliad is rife with examples of gods behaving in very depraved ways, taking sides in very sort of malicious and facetious and petty quarrels between, different states, different cities in Greece. So those stories will be de-emphasized or actually cut out altogether. They actually plan to amputate those stories. Mm-hmm. So here we have, ideas of censorship, basically, as it pertains to these stories of the gods. But then they move on quickly to stories of death and the afterlife. And they make the same stipulation that some of those stories will be told, especially stories that have to do with heroes endeavoring through trials and struggles. But there will be many that are untold just because there's a picture of the underworld in this time of an area of a place where everybody goes, and it's a place of eternal suffering. And what it does is it engenders a fear of death. And then finally, they move to stories of what they call laughter or vigorous laughter, meaning, and what I take this to mean is that they're talking about stories of frivolous amusement. And they say that there's some stories will be told in this regard, as long as they're careful in terms of the amount of entertainment they provide, and so long as they themselves promote the virtuosity that they want the guardians to have. But the stories that have to do with laughter that will be untold are things that are sort of trivial and idle obsessions with amusement. And you certainly would want to discourage laughing at others' suffering too. So they make a brief mention of the story of Hephaestus, which is why they laughed at him. So basically what we have now are these two stratas. So there's the stories of death, and then there's the stories of laughter. And what Socrates is trying to do is, he says, he's trying to port the guardians to be totally focused on the truth. And so what's being built is sort of this middle ground between acting or deciding in the face of fear of death and acting and deciding on things for the pursuit of amusement and entertainment. And what Socrates is doing implicitly is saying, no, that the guardians will be focused on the middle ground. They will not act out of fear of death. They would prefer to die than to be slaves, right? They're going to stand at the full height of their dignity, and they're going to be virtuous, but they're also not going to be so obsessed with the amusements of life to the point that they're idle and frivolous and obsessed with trivial things. And so that the truth is in the middle. And so there's any number of examples in our current modern life where it seems like that seems to be sort of where we are, where we're usually, dealing with people's fears and the systems that are in place, either implicit or explicit, which tend to amplify those fears. And at the same time, all the pressures that we have, for example, in social media, where we sort of get drawn into frivolous amusements and idle frivolity, and none of it really sort of undergirds or reinforces your internal fortitude. So we get to this point, and then this is when I was shocked to read this part of the book, because Socrates just finishes saying that truth is the ultimate concern of the guardians, but it is a privilege to lie. And so this is the part that I wanted to talk to you about, because again, the theme here is that there's this authoritarian streak, and I could rationalize sort of the handling of the guardians, of their indoctrination and their education. But when Socrates says that only the leaders should lie, they're the only ones that should be allowed to lie. In fact, he calls lying sort of like a medicine. He says lying is a medicine, and just like only a physician should be able to prescribe medicine, only leaders should be have the privilege of lying for the purposes of preserving the state. And so that brings up a challenge in my mind cognitively, because lying seems to be in opposition of virtue.
Can you point me to that
sure.
paragraph? Which paragraph is
if
that?
you go to section 389b.
389.
So here, Socrates says, moreover, we have to be concerned about truth as well. So when I read that, a little shadow came in my mind. I was like, well, what are you talking about? And then he goes on, for if what we said just now is correct, and the lie is really useless to the gods, but useful to human beings as a form of drug, it is clear that it must be assigned to doctors, whereas private individuals must have nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, he goes on to explain how it is acceptable for a leader to lie for the purposes of preserving the state.
That is the next paragraph, right?
But the private individual should not be allowed to lie.
Yeah, there is. Do you know why he brings this up?
Yeah, let's talk about it. Because I have an idea, and I have.
Okay, let me tell me your idea, because the thing is, then this goes on to the next chapter. So I don't want to necessarily discuss it here. I can see why he brings it up here.
Oh yeah.
So go ahead.
I can too. Well, there's a difference. Here's my answer. There's a difference between truth and truth telling.
Mm-hmm.
Put simply.
Mm-hmm.
So to be virtuous does not require to be truth telling. Now, virtue and truth probably hold the same status in terms of an ultimate aim for how you should carry yourself in life. But there are certain situations where telling the truth is not the virtuous thing to do, meaning virtue supersedes truth-telling. And there's a very easy example at the very beginning when Socrates is talking to Polemarchus, and he's talking about, well, if somebody's insane and he's asking for his weapons back, you'd say, well, I don't have your weapons, because clearly that person is not in a state.
Mm-hmm.
You see, in that example, virtue superseded truth-telling at that point. The other just easy example I can think of when I was reading this, the example that I thought of, which I would use to explain it to somebody else.
But that's a good enough example. I don't think you need another one. That's a good enough example, what you just gave. That's a pretty good one.
Okay.
Yeah, let's move on from that. That's pretty good. I agree with that.
Sure, but let me just get this example out because I think it might be helpful.
Okay, all right. Let's have a second example.
So just because I think people may not remember that particular example, but for example, it's like if you have a child that brings you a painting, for example, and they say to you, isn't this a great painting? Or isn't this the best painting you've ever seen? Right. And so you're dealing with a child at that point, right? There's a power differential there. And instead of going into like a critical analysis of the shape and form and style of the painting, you would most likely just agree to what the child is saying and for the purposes of being just to that child. It would do this is a very rudimentary example, but it would do nobody any good if you just sort of did a breakdown and said, well, no, this painting is actually not very good because this, and this, and this.
You should have stopped with the prior example.
No, I think this works because the reason you don't do that to a child is because you are in a position of authority and you have a responsibility that supersedes above that, which is the nurturing of the child and frankly to justice. It would be unjust to the child for you to offer something so heavy-handed and critical for something as trivial as that, if that makes sense.
Correct, but there could be a mean there. I mean, you could give criticism appropriate to the level of the child. When we say child, now, if you tell me child, I'm looking at some toddler or maybe just like a 5 or 6 year old.
Yeah, I'm talking about a toddler.
But a child could be 10 or 11. They could be at a point in their life when they get you something and you'll be able to provide them criticism and say, hey, I think you can do better. So I do get your point, though.
Yeah, but
you don't want to be heavy-handed.
It's an oversimplified example, right? So we can talk about
right. But I do get your point.
Useful feedback and growth and stuff. But that's kind of the example. That's just an easy example of where virtue and truth telling are actually in contrast.
So let's go back just a couple of things because you did a great summary so far, and one of the things that you mentioned about essentially was. So there are two things that you brought up, and then you said coming to a mean of those two things, something as grave as death and something as frivolous as mockery or amusement, mockery or amusement. Sure. And then this is more he spoke about mockery essentially, right? Like you're kind of mocking somebody and everybody's having a good time because of that. That's kind of frivolous. That's a waste of anybody's time to mock someone, right? And at the other end is something as grave as death. And you said the midpoint is where we should be. I didn't get that feeling when I read this. Like a lot of that coming to the mean is temperance. I like that. I don't know if mockery and maybe you're right. Maybe gravity and frivolity, and the median of that would be something where I see what you mean now. Yeah,
Right.
I didn't get that feeling here.
Right, and that's how I interpreted it. Because
It makes sense.
You could be overly somber,
Correct.
right, to the point where you're fearful, and then you could also be overly amused or overly obsessed with amusement, where you're obsessed with frivolous things.
Correct. I don't know if fear comes on one end of but gravity and mockery I do. But what I was trying to get at essentially is I looked at them as individual things. What I mean by that is he's talking about what kind of texts or what kind of narrative should the guardians be exposed to. So he brings up death because death is something I believe everybody is fearful of in a way. When I say everybody, most people are fearful of death. And Socrates has mentioned this in the Apology. He talks about this very specifically. He says that I'm going on to meet death and you are going on with your lives. Which one is better? I don't know. And that is contrary to convention. Convention, everybody says
death is bad.
Death is bad. Mm. And where do we get that convention from? That death is bad. Death is as natural a thing as the sunrise. Now, I was having this conversation the other day with someone I know, and I brought up I was trying to talk about truth, and I said, if I were to tell you that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, that's the truth. And if I say that the sun is not going to rise tomorrow, you could say that is not a truth. But then what's an eclipse, right? And I said, the same thing can be said about death. He said, well, no, I don't think so. The sunrise is a hard truth. There is no arguing around it. And then I waited for some time. And then I asked him, isn't the same thing true about death? There is no argument. It's actually as true as the sunrise. As a matter of fact, I didn't have this conversation with him, and I was driving away because we were having some other conversation. I didn't want to necessarily take it away. But I was driving back home. I realized what I wanted to tell him was, on a cosmic scale, the fact that the sun is going to rise tomorrow is not a given. But even on a cosmic scale, death is more real than what the sunrise is. So, point I'm trying to make essentially from the fact is, death is as natural as it gets, but we are still fearful of it. We've built within ourselves, based on what people are exposed to, preservation of life is the most important thing that every organism should be concerned with, preservation of life. And to the point that we are ready to give up on some essential truth about what justice is, or what our role in life is.
Oh, yeah. And adopt superstitions and supernatural ideas.
Right. And participate in things that are unjust, knowing full well that they are unjust, because you want to preserve life. And that's why the stories of people laying their lives down for something that they believe in are so few and far in between, that you have to write about them and discuss about them and figure out how different you are from them. Every time I read about a martyr, in my mind, I'm like, I don't think he had kids. I don't think he had a family. I think society was different then. I try to keep making distances between me and that other person, because that other person chose something as natural as death over relinquishing his truths that he held dearly to his chest. And I'm saying I'm not, that person is very different from me, right? Because I fear death. And if I have guardians in my mind who have to choose between justice and laying down your life for a just cause, my guardians are so weak because of all the prior information that they've gathered about what life is, that they would choose preservation of life over justice.
Yeah. And maybe the reason I have kind of a median between the extremist views of the guardians, or at least this discussion about how the guardians should be indoctrinated, is because what I think the guardians are decisions. I think the guardians are the decisions that we make, because just like the guardians are responsible for the defense and preservation of the state, and just like if the guardians are not well suited or well informed, they will result in the destruction of the state or the fall of the state. It's the same true of our decisions. If we make uninformed decisions out of a pure fear of death, if we make decisions out of a pure pursuit of frivolous amusement, you can see how the system falls, and then the individual falls at that level too.
Right. I like that analogy. Basically, when you say decision, you mean thought. Well,
what I'm saying is, so the reason I use the word decision carefully is because the whole point of philosophy, in my mind, is bringing thought to action. It's what informs the eventual action, which is motivated by the thought. And I like the word decision because it actually converges the two concepts. It converges the two aspects of existence or contemplation, which is thought and action. At some point, you have to make a decision. Now, the decision may have to do with something that you choose or don't choose to believe, or the decision may have something to do with something you choose or don't choose to do. But there's a decision there. So your guardians are your decisions.
Right.
And that's why bad decisions can destroy your life
Correct.
and good decisions can preserve them.
Correct.
And so using that analogy, this is how it makes the most sense to me when I read it. So when I see guardians, I'm thinking decision. So the decisions you make should not be some fleeing of fear. Certainly, well, I mean, death here, I think, is just used as a surrogate for fear. You don't want to make decisions purely out of fear. And you also don't want to just live your life in a way that's sort of, obsessed with trivial and idle amusements. And I think the reason there is kind of a balance is right after that, Socrates invokes the idea of temperance. Now, he doesn't make reference to laughter and death as sort of the extremes, but, that's kind of you were getting at that. And I think you were, in your mind, were heading in that direction. But they do seem to represent sort of like the yin and yang or the extremes of life, that the somber aspects and the sort of the frivolous, amusing, joyful aspects of life. But the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so as long as you're making your decisions to the extent that you can off of what you understand to be a rationally based truth, then I think that's where you have guardians that are effective. So
yeah, no, I understand that, and I like that analogy of looking at guardians as decisions. And there could be a decision hierarchy, and they form one of the earlier parts of that decision hierarchy, where you choose the next series of decisions based on the first decision of whether this is a friend or this is a foe, like the dog.
Right.
Or you're going to be skeptical about new information. It starts there, and then you start making other decisions going down. And similarly, fear of death. You have to figure out if death is in fact something to be afraid of or not.
Is it rational to fear death?
Correct.
I mean, Socrates asked that point blank in Apology, right?
And then from there, you have other decision trees. But death could be death of the person. It could be death of ideas, or death of a certain way of living.
Or identities.
That's right. So if you were to identify yourself as somebody who lives in the 21st century and has to have all the accoutrements that comes with that life, and not just someone living in the 21st century, but also someone who's a physician, and all the stuff that comes with it, that is an identity. And the death of that identity is something that people fear. It's like, if I take this path of justice and start looking at the common good, what happens to this identity of the successful physician in the 21st century with all the luxuries? And that fear of death, that is fear of death, and the guardian has to make a decision whether what is better, a life of the servant, the common good, or a life of luxury, and that's the step that's very difficult to take.
Right, it's a difficult step, but it also is the foundational step of this idea of pursuing virtue.
Correct.
Right? So this is why the idea of the guardians being informed and at once secure and skeptical at the same time.
Correct.
That is the linchpin of virtue.
Because you could also argue the other way. You could say, how do you know that whatever path you're taking is actually the path to common good? Why should I give up luxury for that?
Right.
And then, so you could be skeptical both ways. And hence it's important to be able to live a life and learn from that life. And that is where practical wisdom of phronesis comes from. The example that you gave about your friend asking you back for that weapon when that friend is not in a good state of mind. Yes, you could make a guess that this is probably not the right thing to do. That's obviously an example that is kind of extreme. But all those other examples which are not as extreme, you get a better sense of what needs to be done based on phronesis.
Right.
You see what I mean? Like when you take a step toward the common good, then you can say, oh, this is not for me, or this is for me.
Yeah.
But sitting in a lap of luxury saying, oh, the common good is not for me, is not phronesis. That is just using convention, your old way of thinking, the way that society has influenced you, and you don't even realize you are influenced because your guardians have never been exposed to another way of thinking.
Right.
So that's what I get that. And so there are other things that he talks about here too. And I feel like he starts talking a little bit about Stoicism here as well. Man, so
the first thing that I wrote was Seeds of Stoicism. The first thing I
Which one is that? That is 387?
Yeah, so in verses 387 to So
It's the exact
When I- when I-
suggestive of stoicism right there.
on my very first read through, I said, well, here it is. These are the seeds of stoicism, and I'll read the phrases.
Right.
Basically, when he's going off on the guardians who are more willing to be free, and they fear slavery more than death. Right. So again, this is focusing on your own decisions, on your own opinions, and regardless of what happens around you. Then the next phrase is right out of the 387, where he says, what we claim is that a good man won't think that death is a terrible thing for another good one to suffer, even if the latter happens to be his friend. So again, that's very much resonates with the Stoic ideal. And then this one, especially at 387E, but we also claim this: a good person is most self-sufficient when it comes to living well, and is distinguished from other people by having the least need of anyone or anything else. Again, it's sort of this turning inward for your own your own internal fortitude. And then finally, and actually there's other references here, but this is another one that cements it, where he says that, so he will lament it the least and bear it the most calmly when some such misfortune overtakes him.
That's so you're right. Those are the ones that I marked.
So when I read this, I was like, oh, there it is.
There it is. And that's where it comes from, right?
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
that's where the seeds of Stoicism were from Platonic works. I mean,
Well,
this is a great conversation.
Yeah, this is seeds of Stoic. Yeah, this book. So book 3. So yes, it is the kind of the beginning of the authoritarian turn of things. But if you read deep, you find very rich material here, because the seeds of Stoicism here and how they're inextricably linked to virtue is also seeded in this chapter as well.
Correct. And so the guardians will not fear either death nor loss. Both of them they will not fear. And that's what's important. And so then it comes to, since we are talking about Stoicism, I moved on to this mirth issue, this laughing at someone else's expense. He's not saying that one should not laugh or partake in the enjoyment of life.
Right.
He's talking about excessive laughter. And if I look at my own life, times when I've actually excessively laughed out loud was either because someone was being mocked and I wanted to be part of that group that was mocking the person, or I wanted to feel included, or I wanted to impress somebody. These are the reasons why. Like, if I want to impress you and you crack a joke, even if I don't find it very funny, I'll be like slapping my thigh and laughing out loud. You know that fake laugh, right? I mean, we've seen it, and it happens all the time.
Well, I hope I haven't seen your fake laugh.
Is it right now? Okay. Let's see.
There it is again.
These are actually very funny. I roll. But my point is that these are the times when you find yourself in that situation. We've all done it. I know that I've been part of it myself. I've been ridiculed, and I know other people have slapped their thighs and laughed. And so that kind of laughter, that is frivolous. It just leads to nothing. And we see that a lot. Now, I don't believe necessarily that intelligent humor, where, you see stand-up comedians and people like that, you find them who have something nice to say. They are on the stage and they are talking about things that are extremely funny, but at the same time very poignant. Those are the best comics. Now you have to differentiate that from, your run-of-the-mill comic that is just making fun of things and just to get a good laugh.
The crude example would be like the insult comic or something.
Yeah. The roasts and things like that, as opposed to someone really bringing up something profound and you laugh at it. But when you are laughing, what it's doing, it's creating a discomfort inside of you. Plato was against comics, especially their generation of insult comics were different, where Socrates would actually be portrayed in these comical poems and things like that. So I see why he brings it up. Maybe it's his bias, I don't know. But he doesn't necessarily talk about that kind of comedy. I think what he's talking about more is based on this slapping your thigh and laughing at somebody, that kind of frivolousness. Because if one is a Stoic, one would not engage in that anyways. You have to have a median when it comes to enjoying even mirth. It has to have, not that you would not participate in something that brings you joy, but you would stay away from participating in something that is frivolous. So I think he does plant the seeds of Stoicism. But that's how I took those whole mirth business. I didn't necessarily take it as the mean. But now thinking about it, what you were saying makes sense too, because you can look at the gravity and the frivolity and the median of it. That'll be Stoicism in a way. Yeah,
it's on a different scale, but yeah. But what you're saying, I agree with. And so there does seem to be at a certain point where, if you watch a comedian the show has to end, right? I mean, there's always the end of the show. And that's part of the point of all this, is that you can get to the point where if you keep pursuing things, they're not funny anymore. There's something that happens when you keep trying and trying and trying. And that's because at some point we have to center ourselves once again and deal with the serious aspects of life in a rational, meaningful way. And the issue with, I think, comedy, and I guess now we're getting into like philosophy of comedy, that I think when you consider comedy, there's part of it that is, yes, you can do it as a means to sort of cope with the day-to-day drudgery of life, or as a means to, alleviate pent-up stress and energy, and who doesn't like to laugh and that sort of thing. But it's really hard to laugh and do so in a way that is so raucous and so convulsant, and still maintain some sense of deep meaning about life in general. So, I mean, I think it can be an escape, and it can be a way to look at new. There's always like subtle truths within comedy, and it's just a nice way of looking at things from a different angle. And it's certainly fun to do. But if it ever became a goal in and of itself, you would lose all seriousness in life and really not, carry the weight of meaning of thought and action that you need to live a good life.
Your guardian has to be skeptical. That's all that means.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you cannot participate in it. Your guardians have to be a little skeptical when you're participating in it, knowing that you're not going overboard with this. So then comes this issue about this lie and the big lie. And I think it comes up down the line as to who then is allowed to lie. Because lies are sometimes important, like you said, you cannot have a cardinal rule saying that no one would lie, that's always bad. That's not going to happen. But that's what we teach our kids, right? You should never lie. And what we're telling in our mind to them, what we are trying to tell them essentially, you should try not to lie, but there are certain situations which you have to, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. To me, this is the most intriguing part of the dialogue so far, because it's, there's hazard in this statement.
There is hazard in the statement.
Right.
But what that means to say essentially is that if one has their guardians fully developed, the guardians can then figure out how to use ruse to prevent uprisings from within and exploitation from without by using ruse. And in that case, that would not necessarily be the wrong thing. But if you have within your city folks who are lying, and they are lying for personal gain. Like he gives examples here. He says craftsmen, whether they're a prophet, a doctor who heals the sick,
right,
or a carpenter that works with wood, they will be punished for introducing a practice that is subversive and destructive of a city as of a ship. So if whatever you're saying, the lie that you're saying, or you believe to be, if you don't, first of all, you don't believe it to be true, it's not ignorance. You actually are lying. Mm-hmm. And you're lying it for the destruction of the city, but for your own benefit. This is the individual. This is the example of a city. But inside of an individual, there could be certain ideas. The ideas will lead to the destruction of your mind, but they will continue to support that idea in and of itself, a bad idea. It's a lie, right? That if I buy that German car, it's going to make me happy. That's a lie. Correct. It's going to destroy the peace of your house and your mind and everything else. And it's a lie, because once you get it, you'll be like, oh, okay, I got this. That same thought is now going to say, now if I had a pretty blonde to go with it, that'll be better. You can just add to the mix. I don't know, for example. But what I'm trying to say essentially is, he brings up the point about a doctor who heals the sick. And if you look at our society right now, and you and me are both physicians, right? I mean, they keep emphasizing a physician who's lying. What would that lie be from a physician's perspective? It's not about, sometimes it could be something like, trying to use an antiparasitic to kill a virus. That could be a lie. But it could also be maybe participating in a system that does not provide equitable care to everybody, and saying that you're actually out there to help society and participate in the healing process, because that could be a lie that you tell yourself. See what I mean? And physicians should not be allowed to participate in a lie like that. That means, what he means to say essentially is, like, a bad idea should not be allowed to to sustain itself.
Yeah, it's right. So there's a contrast here that's happening because it seems like it's overall a critique of deliberate misinformation, right? So, but it's again, that's why I came at the conclusion that what he's trying to do is parse out the difference between truth and truth telling. Truth is always commendable and worth pursuing, but there's certain situations where truth telling may not be what aligns with what the most virtuous action is at that moment, which is the example of, the very rudimentary example of, just telling a child that their painting is great when you really think it's, not a very good piece of artwork. But that's a very simplistic example. But there's other examples where in order to preserve the health and well-being of a larger system, there may be situations where telling the truth at that moment, and again, this sounds very authoritarian to say, is not the best thing to do. Because you may not have all the information that you have. You don't know all the contextual variables. And this is why the initial example that was brought up in the dialogue is also very good. Because just as you pointed out, if somebody's running back to you and asking for their weapons back and they've got this wild look in their eye, all of a sudden there's these questions. Why? And why do you seem so desperate? And are you really in your right state of mind? And yes, you have a right to this weapon, but should I give it to you at this moment? All of these factors start to come into play. But if you have a rational sense that the best thing to do at that moment is not to give your friend that weapon or to tell that child that their painting is not very good, there must be a very good reason for it. Okay? And the best reason for it would be to do the right thing to the extent that you understand what that is. So if you ask the question, then you're asking the question because you're trying to figure out what the truth is and you're trying to promote the best possible outcome for the most number of people. But if you're not telling the truth for some other reason than that, then that should be punished. According to what we're reading here, that is precisely what Socrates is critiquing.
Yeah, so I was trying to come, and your point is very well taken. That's so if you look at it from a healthcare perspective, say you are a CEO of a healthcare corporation, right? And you understand the nature of common good. But now you have to convince the shareholders that you're going to participate in whatever they believe as to be the reason why they should be stakeholders in your company. So there is an idea that you have that you believe is going to serve the most number of people. But in order to sell it to your board, you have to say that it is going to generate the most amount of money. Now, that is a lie that you'll have to kind of state. Now, it'll be great if that both of those things are true, that, it generates the most amount of money and it's good for everybody. But usually that's not the case usually. You have to kind of give up a little bit of that profit making. But if you go to your board and you present it such that this is in fact great for the board because it's going to make a ton of profit, right? And in your mind, your reason you're doing it is because it serves the greatest number of people. You are now in a position to state a big lie. And that lie is actually a virtuous lie. Now, let's look at it the other way around.
Well, and it's virtuous because, again,
you have the aim. You have the aim.
Right. To the extent that you've maximized your awareness of the situation, you would lie to avoid a larger injustice.
Correct. And that's what you're trying to do.
So to lie to the unjust system is actually virtuous. Is it not?
Yeah,
history is full of examples of that, right?
Right. But this is a little bit more different than, standing up for what is truth. You can scream truth at an unjust system, or you can have a ruse.
This would be more subtle.
Yeah, this would be more subtle. This would be a ruse, and so as opposed to the other way around. The other way around would be there's a CEO of a company, right? And he's coming to the doctors now of a healthcare corporation. He's coming to the doctors now and saying, hey, you know what? This new endeavor that you're going to do is going to be really good for your patients. It's going to provide more care for people. It's going to make them healthier and happier. But in his mind, he knows that it's going to generate the most amount of profit. Now that is also a ruse. That's also a lie. That's the kind of lies that we should not allow our guardians to believe in.
Right, because that one is not aligned with virtue.
That's correct.
Right. It's aligned with something else. That's
correct. But saying that these are rules that we tell ourselves. If you think about it, these are the kind of conversations we have. I'm going to work for this particular corporation because it pays more money, And that's what we believe to be the truth. But we tell ourselves, but you know what? It's a large healthcare corporation. I'll be in touch with more people. I'll be working more. So I'll have, you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I'll be doing more good, but that's actually not your primary purpose. I think I've belabored the point. That's the point.
But it's an important point. And again, that's why I arrived at that conclusion that virtue supersedes truth telling.
Yeah.
And so look at all we've discussed, and this is how many? I mean, we're like barely 3 pages into book 3.
You win. I said you should go further. You're like, nah, 390, my friend. Stop. But the other thing is, he also says this, and of course, we must not allow our men to be bribable with gifts or to be money lovers. You know, this is 390D. Mm-hmm. It's 390D.
Yeah.
Gift persuade gods and gift persuade revered kings, but you know, we must not sing songs like that. You see what I mean?
Right.
Like just you did. Here's the thing: doing goodness for its own sake, right? What we tell everybody is, if you do good, twice as much will come back onto you. If you help your neighbor, your neighbor will help you. This is the story we tell our children. Mm-hmm. Do good unto others so that others will do others. Yeah. Right. And that is gift seeking. Like, the reason why you're doing it is not because it is good in and of itself. It's because the rewards you're waiting to receive. And if you don't receive those rewards, you're like, nah, man, that doesn't make sense. I'm not going to do any good to anybody in the future. That is, your guardians have to kind of have that decision tree. The decision tree doesn't start with, should I participate in the common good so that some good comes off of it to me personally, for my own personal self? Or should I just participate only in my own personal self and then see whatever good comes out of it for someone else? That's a decision tree.
Yeah, and this is a good transition point, because what you've done is arrived at the point that Socrates arrived at in 392 when he says, then we won't come to an agreement about what stories should be told about human beings. So he's moved on from guardians, until we have discovered what sort of thing justice is and how, given its nature, it profits the one who has it, whether he is believed to be just or not. That's getting exactly at the point you just made. So here, in the next section, he's going to move on to a little bit more about discussions about the form and function of what they call poetry. But I think there's lots of analogies in our own existence. What they call poetry, we could really, any sort of media that we interact with, that we use to help us make decisions and the things that influence us, we should really look at those things skeptically. And so we can talk more about that on the next episode.
Yeah, so that is you said you ended at 392.
392C.
C, right? Yeah, that's right? Because right before that, he brings up Glaucon and Adeimantus's argument. The argument that set all this up. True injustice versus true justice is this paragraph of 392B, right? Mm-hmm. He says, because what we are going to say, I imagine, is that poets and prose writers get the greatest things concerning human beings wrong. They say that many unjust people are happy and many just ones wretched, that doing injustice is profitable if it escapes detection, and that justice is another's good but one's own loss. We will forbid them to say such things. I imagine that's comma, and order them to sing and tell the opposite. Don't you think so? So
right. This is basically a more elaborate language to make the same point that you're making, which is this idea of doing good because you'll get reward.
Correct.
No. That's the argument they're trying to take down.
Correct.
With this example.
This is how he's trying to break down. He's trying to break down Glaucon and Adeimantus's argument by talking about this, and this is why guardians are important inside our minds to be able to then participate in justice. What a book, man!
We're not even a third of the way through.
No, we're not even a third of the way through. You're right.
All right, but we'll pick it up next time.
Yes, sir.